So I decided to take on the myth, the people hate America. Where does that myth come from? Well, there's a long history to that myth, but I'm going to give one of the most common images that's associated with it. And this was the cover of Newsweek magazine, an famous and infamous for many people, cover story written by the famous and sometimes infamous journalist Fareed Zakaria. I say that famous and infamous because people debate him quite fiercely, and this article, notorious is a good word because it has a little bit less value judgment immediately. And he took, of course, an old idea that was circulating out there, and just to immediately deconstruct my myth, and I didn't start my clock, so you have to tell me, Tim, that they hate us is a simple way in which a literature professor like myself would start to take apart this myth. In giving an image of someone who is a child who has a gun, and immediately signals, and if we had a long time to take apart this image itself, it uses a lot of visual iconography to scare the heck out of us. Of course, us is an imagined reader of any magazine, especially a national magazine like Newsweek. The title of my book that comes out in the fall, After the American Century, comes from Henri famous 1941 essay, The American Century, which also spoke to a national us and kind of created the idea that people reading an article should share a common point of view and immediately become interpolated into that point of view. So why they hate us, this image, these words that Fareed Zakaria did not write really any of the cover, becomes associated with the position that we should be terrified, and this big, and let's use this word, monolithic they is out there to hate a big and not diverse in us, that we all can come together in this moment. So the image itself speaks very quickly and broadly. Of course, in itself, this image, this article, and when you go back, and I reread the article today to remind myself of what the content of it was, although a lot of people don't really need to remember the content because the phrase itself is what stuck in people's heads. It had a lot of, it was repeating a lot of ideas that had been circulating out there, that basically the Arab world or the Muslim world kind of removed of its incredible diversity and difference and histories, was all kind of in a state of failure. Just to quote one, if poverty produced failure in most of Arabia, wealth produced failure in the rest of it. So basically, in kind of Fareed Zakaria's idea, the Middle East was stuck in a kind of history of failure, and that somehow translated into a rage that even children who, before they could think about what they were thinking about, carried forward with them. Okay.
So the myth I'm going to discuss tonight in 7-8 minutes, it's really hard to deconstruct myths in that short amount of time, is the men oppress their women. So whenever I get on an airplane or a train and a conversation starts out with the person sitting next to me, and they ask, so what do you do? I say, I'm an anthropologist, I work in the Middle East. And invariably, they say, what's it like being a woman over there? Or, the men oppress their women, right? So this is a phrase that I hear regularly in introducing myself to the broader public. So what's the matter with this phrase? Well, first of all, it starts with the men. We're talking about a region of 380 million people. That's more than the United States. If we say about half of them are men, that's 190 million men. Are we willing to generalize about all of those men? Are we willing to generalize about all of the men in the United States, for example, given what we know about geographic, economic, educational, and racial, ethnic, etc. differences? Would we do the same in the Middle East region, where there's not just one country, but there's 19 countries, all with vastly different histories, all with varying ethnic, religious, and cultural trends, as well as ecological diversity. And each one of these countries has a different political and economic system. So it simply becomes impossible to generalize about the men and the women. There's also the phrase, they're women. It's interesting that Americans say that phrase a lot, they're women, referring to the Middle East. There's a notion of possession in that, right? Like, they're women, they own their women. But it's coming in our language, in our frameworks that we use to discuss the region. So I find that pretty interesting and problematic. And I'm sure there are a lot of men among the 190 million who would take exception to the notion that women belong to them. We also find this in our language as well when we use the phrase women and children. For example, we're talking about casualties or victims or people deserving of social services or whatever. Why do we always lump together women and children? So my point is, even within our own discourse, there is this kind of generalizing and kind of infantilizing framework directed towards women. So we also...
When we look at Islamic sources themselves, well then the thing that's tricky is what exactly are we looking for to know whether we see signs of politics or not. If we look, for instance, in the Quran for the notion of caliphate or the term caliph, it shows up only twice, only one of which could really be understood in a political sense. We find it more often in the hadith, the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, but then again, what does that mean? Does that mean that it is necessarily a mandatory institution that has to exist at any point in history? Some people will make that argument. Some people would actually disagree with this. When we look at the life of Prophet Muhammad, then of course it's also trickier. Prophet Muhammad played many roles in his life. Yes, he was a prophet. Yes, he was a preacher. He was also a military commander. You can make the argument that he played the role of a statesman. Now, what should we make of this? Should Muslims, after the death of the last prophet, should someone play all of these roles? Certainly the prophetic role cannot be played by anyone else. Does that mean that somebody else has to play the political role? Muslims actually disagree very much about these issues. So what I want to say is that I'm not going to replace one myth by another. I do believe that it's a myth, the idea that Islam is inherently political. I don't think we should replace this by a myth that says there's absolutely nothing political about Islam. The reality is that Muslim activists, Muslim intellectuals, can make both kinds of arguments depending on what aspect of the tradition they focus on. So do you have people who are actually Muslim activists who say that Islam is inherently political? Absolutely. These people are out there and they make that argument. Now they will argue that in the past there's always been a consensus among Muslim scholars that Islam is political and the Muslim community has to have a leader. They'll make the argument that in the past, in the golden age of Islam, there was always a caliph and Islamic law had to be enforced by political authority, and so therefore it should be the same thing nowadays. Now they're focusing on a particular aspect of the tradition. The truth is that you have other scholars who look at that tradition but see something else. They say, well, yes, there was a consensus back in the days, but consensus is something that can be renegotiated. As a source of knowledge about the religion, we're entitled to reconsider this consensus. Or they will focus on the history and they'll say, well, actually, when we look closely at the pre-modern period, we see that there was a de facto separation between the religious sphere and the political sphere. There were emirs who held political power. They were not themselves religious scholars, and they did not necessarily rule as religious individuals. They may have had some kind of religious legitimacy, perhaps because they funded schools or because they were pious individuals themselves, but they were not religious scholars, and they did not make statements about what the religion should be or how the religion should be implemented. This was the role of religious scholars. And so they'll say there was a de facto separation in the pre-modern period. Maybe that de facto separation can be revived today. And so therefore the idea that the Muslim community necessarily needs to have a political leader, it's an idealized version of the past that doesn't necessarily need to be revived today. So
not as bad. So these conflicts seem like they're about identity groups that many would say groups that have been fighting against themselves, against each other since time immemorial. Groups that have been hating each other for hundreds of years, have never gotten along, and given any opportunity will fight against each other again. So I would argue against this myth. Groups haven't necessarily been fighting against each other or hating each other since ancient times. Identities matter for politics, but they do in ways that are contingent, that are constructed, that are political, and often very modern. So how do I go about proposing and sort of making this claim to you? One, I would ask, what is a sect? A sect is a subdivision within a religious group or community group. What makes sect different than sectarianism? Or what makes tribe, an extended family or kinship group, different than tribalism? The key is in the ism. What is that ism? The ism refers to an ideology that attaches importance to those differences. Not the differences per se, which may have existed a long time, but what attaches a particular importance and a political importance. What is it that makes these identities important for politics? That hasn't been inherited as much as created, reinforced, contested, and made a part of modern politics. It's not identities per se, but more particularly the ways that identities have been wrapped up in power and the distribution of power in politics in a region. Not sect per se that matters, but sect plus power, which creates inequalities, abuses, resentments, falling along identity-based lines when they could have perhaps fallen along other lines, reinforced over the years, institutionalized in political parties, in political institutions, in distributions of resources that creates and helps create conflict. Making distinctions that aren't necessarily political, deeply political. Making distinctions which are not necessarily given seem as natural as nature itself. So,